Good morning. We're just a few weeks away from Good Friday and Easter, and as we lead up to the Easter season, I'm continuing a series on that very well-known fourth servant song of Isaiah. And the sermon today is the second sermon in that series. And the title of the sermon today is The Humiliation of God. The humiliation of God. And I'm looking this morning at the first three verses of Isaiah 53. The first thing I want to draw your attention to in these verses is that there's a very big contrast between verses 1 and 2. In verse 1, Isaiah talks about the arm of the Lord. Let me read. He says, "Who has believed our message, and to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed?" The arm of the Lord. What is it? Well, of course, his arm is a symbol of his strength. The Bible often talks about God's mighty hand, his outstretched arm. And with his arm, God gives them food, he delivers them. With his arm, he carries them out of Egypt, and so on. But then in verse 2, Isaiah goes on to describe the arm of God. And the picture which follows is a terrible picture of dreadful weakness. A tender shoot, a root in dry ground, an ugly little thing which would go on to be despised and rejected by men. Do you see the contrast? Is this pathetic picture a picture of God's strength? Is this really the best that God can do? Let me read the whole of that description to you from Isaiah 53 verses 2 and 3. "He grew up before him like a tender shoot and like a root out of dry ground. He had no beauty or majesty to attract us to him, nothing in his appearance that we should desire him. He was despised and rejected by men, a man of sorrows and familiar with suffering, like one from whom men hide their faces. He was despised and we esteemed him not." Now, do you see anything beautiful in this description? No, there's nothing beautiful, nothing powerful. It's gruesome, it's weak, it's horrible, it's unimaginable. It reminds us of the Jesus of the Gospels who came unto his own, but his own did not receive him. When he came, he was despised and rejected of men. He suffered terribly at the hands of his accusers. And to cap it all off, he was put to a gruesome death. If you go back to the end of Isaiah 52, you see that people were appalled at him. Why? Why were they appalled? Because, says Isaiah, his appearance was so disfigured, beyond that of any man. His form was marred beyond human likeness. Now, the Gospels only very briefly summarise the sufferings of Jesus on that last day, but you can be sure of this, he suffered terribly. And when he made that final walk to Golgotha, when he didn't even have the strength anymore to carry his own cross, the people were appalled. The people were appalled. And I want you to have this picture of the gruesome Jesus firmly in your mind. Why? Because this is your God. And I say it again, this appalling, pathetic, humiliated figure, this is your God. Now, I know that some will quickly say, God the Father didn't die on the cross. No, he didn't. But in our quickness to say that the Father did not die, we overlook the great mystery of the Trinity, that Jesus is co-equal, co-eternal, co-God with the Father. You remember John 14, Philip asked Jesus, he said, Lord, show us the Father, and that'll be enough for us. And Jesus said, Philip, don't you know me? If you knew me, who you've walked with the last 3 years, you would know my Father. Don't you believe that I am in the Father and that the Father is in me? And the words I'm saying to you, they're not my own, but it is the Father living in me doing his work. Now, don't ask me to explain that. The Trinity is a tremendous mystery. But as Christians, we believe, as we sing in that song, that Jesus is our God. Well, what's the point? What's the point that I'm making? The point I'm making is that this terrible picture of Isaiah 53, this terrible humiliation, this terrible suffering is Yahweh himself. This is your Maker. And it is this staggering realization, this unbelievable reality, which in chapter 52 startles men and shuts their mouth. You see, as human beings, we can and we do have lots of interesting philosophical discussions around the office table with each other about who God is or about even what God is. And yet somehow all our talking is over when we stand confronted with our God upon a cross. There just doesn't seem to be much left that we can say. We can't really shout anymore into the dark sky, God, we don't know who you are. You're invisible. You're unknown. Come out of the darkness. Show yourself. Because here in Isaiah 53, he says, my child, what more must I do to show you who I am? How much lower do you want me to go? There is no lower. I've been to the lowest place. I have poured out my heart. The deepest word of my divine heart is now made flesh for all the world to see. The humiliation of God, congregation, is the most awesome thought in the whole world. Think of everything that you know about God, about his majesty, about his power, about his glory, about his holiness, his infinity, his eternity, his eternal kingship. Think of him, all you know of him, and then multiply your greatest thoughts 1,000 times, and I tell you, you have not begun to imagine the essence, the greatness, the power, and the majesty of God. God is utterly awesome and almighty. And then the humiliation, to step down from that, to lay aside all that glory, for the uncreated one to step into the form of the created, for the sinless one to step into the form of sinners, And then, as he steps into his own world, to be greeted in the terrible way that he was. To be hated, to be despised and rejected by men. For those little leaders of the Jewish church to lord it over the Lord of Lords and the King of Kings. For the rulers of the puny nations to spit in the face of him who is the ruler and creator of all. For the men and women of earth to despise the King of heaven. How would you act in his shoes? As you, the King of the universe, are asked to justify yourself again and again to the petty elders, before Pontius Pilate, as you are then whipped by drunken, jeering soldiers, as you are mocked and dressed up and with a crown of thorns forced upon your head, then being crucified on a cross, and then for the laughing soldiers to say, come down from your cross. How would you act? And yet he was silent. He was silent. And then he prayed. And he said, Father, forgive them, because they have no idea. They have no idea of what they are doing. Brothers and sisters, this is your God. When our God, Yahweh, saw the extent of our mess, and when he saw that we as human beings could not save ourselves, he stepped down to do it for us. God is a very personal God. It's impossible for God, impossible for him to speak to us any more clearly than he has done in the cross. Think again of that unbelievable thought, the humiliation of God, and ask yourself, why? Why the eternally great God of highest heaven would allow himself to be humiliated in this unbelievable way? I'll look at this further next week, when we will see that he was pierced for our transgressions. He chose to be crushed for our iniquities, and the punishment that brought us peace was upon him. Can you see what a beautiful person God is? This is not a man dying for his mates. This is your God. This is the one who made you. What a beautiful, beautiful person he is. Another word for beauty is glory. He is just so magnificently glorious, beautiful beyond all description. He's so beautiful. And when you see this unbelievable beauty of God, like the prodigal son who was whiling his life away in the pigsty, you will ask yourself, what am I doing? What am I doing in the pigsty of my life? I see how beautiful my Father is. I'm going home. I'm going home. And when you say that, do you know that God is waiting at the door? And he will smile with deep joy and satisfaction. And he will be running to meet you as you are running to meet him. Going back to our text now, we look at the humiliation of God, this terrible picture of the suffering servant. And suddenly we realise, hey, this really is the best that God can do. And suddenly we understand what Paul is talking about in 1 Corinthians when he says that the foolishness of God is wiser than man's wisdom, and that the weakness of God is stronger than man's strength. Now, still today, of course, people laugh, they mock at the weakness of the cross. But do you know what I say to them? I say to them, for one moment, put yourself in the shoes of the King of Heaven in all your glory. Just imagine for one moment that you are the ruler of all. And then let them lay aside that glory. Let them be humiliated to become the suffering servant we see in Isaiah 53. And let them go one step further, and while they are crucifying you, pray for the forgiveness of those who are spitting in your divine face. Brothers and sisters, that's not weakness. It's not weakness. That is a power more awesome than we can imagine, isn't it? I mean, I don't know about you, but I find it hard just to say sorry. I just can't imagine the humiliation of God. For God to lay aside all his glory and then be despised and rejected by the very creatures that you have made. But he did. That is what Isaiah talks about in chapter 53, the unbelievable arm of the Lord. Now maybe you are a person who struggles to make your own faith personal. If you do, I want you to remember that God is just another person. And when I say just, I don't, of course, mean to drag the King of Heaven down in any way. He is a person like we have never known. He's a very beautiful person, he's a very powerful person, but he is just a person. And in the cross, he is opening up his divine heart to us. And he's saying to us, my child, this is how far I will go to bring you home, to bring you to understand who I am. And as we gaze into the heart of God, as we stand looking into the magnificence of the humiliation of God, as we gaze into the heart that brought this about, what we see there is a friend who loves us very much, a friend who wants us to see him and understand him, adore him, love him, and worship him. He wants us to see his glory, his beauty, that he is the most beautiful person we can ever imagine, who laid aside all his glory to become Jesus on a cross. And he hung there on that cross until that final moment when he could cry out, "It is finished. It is finished." God actually did it. He did it. He went all the way to death for us. And nothing can ever destroy this holy moment, because it is here in this moment as the divine being, the majestic invisible one, dies. It is at this moment that he has shown his world the full extent of who he is. And if we, from out of our darkness, if this truth penetrates, if we are brought to see this awesome picture of God, if we finally come to stand confronted with our Maker on a cross, there's not much left to say, is there? There's not much left that we can say except bow down in adoration, in worship, and in joyful surrender. And that's the very thing we were made for. We were made to know and understand our God, to enjoy him, and to worship him forever. Will you do that? If you're walking away from him today, let me tell you, today is the day to come home. Yes, even as the world falls down around us with the coronavirus and all the havoc that is creating, today is the day to come home. With Isaiah, I asked the question, who has believed this message? It really is staggeringly unbelievable. But it's true. Our God is a staggeringly awesome God. Come, let us bow down. Let us worship him today. Amen.